Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for my patience. I'm sorry to have kept you waiting. It was entirely my fault. It's a very great pleasure to welcome the festival's best friend. He is incomparable in erudition, in intellect, in the ability to challenge every accepted norm. He is the great contrarian. Here to talk about Thomas Paine is Christopher Hitchens.
Thank you, Peter, for that suspiciously terse introduction. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. I normally scorn and despise the dog and pony show, the teacher's aid, the PowerPoint and so forth, but this I couldn't resist, and I thought we would go through it together. I could share it with you. It's a piece of poetry I came across in the work for this book. If there isn't a pointer, but I'm going to just point and ask you to memorize. Yes. So, could you put it one line down? One line. Nope. Exactly where it was before. Exactly where it was before, please, the arrow. This is why I don't do this stuff. There's something now that's obscuring the second line, and the arrow was just where it should have been. Can you hear me? Oh, for heaven's sake. The nightmare of the demagogue. No. If you could just get the garbage off the screen, I can do the rest. Can anyone hear? Okay. Leave it. Don't do anything. Now. Picture, if you will. Just talk amongst yourselves for a bit, and there will be. Actually, while they do that, we can just all read it together, can we? Would you mind? The pomp of courts and pride of kings. Come on, give it some welly. I prize above all earthly things. I love my country, the king. Above all men, his praise I sing. The royal banners are displayed, and may success the stand at aid. Second verse. Just remember, keep it there. I fain would banish far from hence the rights of man and common sense. Confusion to his odious reign, that foe to princes, Thomas Paine. Defeat and ruin seize the cause of France, its liberties and laws. Now, in 1798, who here has read Thomas Flanagan's trilogy of novels about the liberation of Ireland? The first one is called The Year of the French. Well, you should. And it describes the rebellion that year of the United Irishmen. Theobald Wolfe-Tone, Lord Edward Fitzgerald. Some revolutions are revolutions manquées. Some revolution trahie. This Irish revolution was basically premature. It didn't much stand a chance, but it was the germinal moment for later, much broader and deeper movements. And one of its leaders was a man named Arthur O'Connell, who the British decided to put in custody. And as he was being led away from his trial, he capitulated. He surrendered. He gave in. He said, all right, you win. I give up. And he handed out this poem that you see. A more or less total sellout. But if you will now, ladies and gentlemen, read the first line of the first verse aloud. The pomp of courts and prize of kings. And then the first line of the second verse beginning, I fain. I prize above all earthly things. I love my country, the king. Confusion to his odious reign. The royal banners are displayed. No, wait. Above all men's praise I sing, that foe to Princess Thomas Paine. The royal banners are displayed. Defeat and ruin seize the cause. And may success the stand at aid. One of the mistakes made by the British establishment historically has been to consider the Irish people as stupid. we have paid a very high price for this stupidity. I think the second version is much better, don't you? And also appropriate, because with Thomas Paine, we are confronted with a sort of figure in the carpet. There's no real memorial to him in his country of birth. There's no day that honours him. He's not taught in the schools. There's no real memorial to him in his country of adoption, though he is really the unofficial founding father and undoubtedly the moral author of the Declaration of Independence. He was a very obscure person. We don't know much about his early life. He didn't write many letters or keep many diaries. He didn't have an official biographer. As he said, the world was his country, his mind was his church, and his religion was to do good. And he was made an honorary member of the United Irishmen, a very rare privilege for an Englishman to be invited to do so, of this wonderful Protestant Republican organization, because of the tremendous success and appeal of his book, the great bestseller, The Rights of Man, about which I've published a little study. And though he's obscure and occluded in the way that we normally consider great men, that theory of history, he's still alive in what Yeats used to call the Book of the People. I would describe him in a way as a Promethean figure. The concept of right, until he put pen to paper, was something that was discussed among theologians and among the church of philosophers. There was a long argument, as you know, between John Locke and Thomas Hobbes about whether there were such things as rights, where they came from, how they originated, how they were to be defined, and to whom they ought to apply. Paine broke open this private discussion and decided to put it in front of a mass audience. And he emerges at a time when the shape of the common man is changing. There's an increasingly self-educated artisan class of people who can read. And there are people who have dimly heard of Sir Isaac Newton and his discoveries, of Benjamin Franklin and his discoveries about lightning. Popular working men's clubs and coffee houses convene to discuss science and reason and political justice. And Paine emerges really as the perfect spokesman of this kind of politics and decides to say, if there are to be rights, and the ruling class can't very well say there are not, because it's only a very brief time since they claimed that there was a divine right of kingship. They can't say the concept is meaningless, as Marx and Bentham later do. They have to say there is such a thing. Paine says if there are rights, then they belong to all of us. They are inherent and innate. They come from a time before there were bishops, before there were kings, before there were predator governments, and they can and must always be asserted. And this is the first time that the word rights and the word man, or properly I think mankind, what we would now call human rights, first time those two words have ever appeared in the same sentence. A breathtaking idea, and instantly taken up by millions of people on both sides of the Atlantic and both sides of the English Channel. Up until then, popular rebels had usually been commanded by noblemen. Llewellyn ap Griffith in the present case, Robert the Bruce, even Oliver Cromwell was a nobleman, or by agrarian types like Wat Tyler, or right up to the levellers and the diggers of the Cromwellian Revolution, about whom Paine had learned from his father, his Quaker father in Suffolk, the great tradition of English liberty before the Norman conquest, before the Norman yoke, as it was so often called, who in a great line of Milton's, which was Orwell's favourite line, incidentally. I think it's from Lycidas. Anyway, it's a line of Milton's, and it says that there's a justification by the known rules of ancient liberty. In other words, there's an understanding that this is only temporary, that the rule of the crown and the church can be transcended. What are the achievements of Paine in this way? Well, he is the moral author of the American Revolution, as I said. He took ship with a letter from Benjamin Franklin to escape the ground-down life he was living in England, and he arrived in Philadelphia just on the cusp of the great conflict between the 13 colonies and the mother country over unfair taxation and political repression, and became the greatest pamphleteer not just of that but of any other time, by writing two short pamphlets, one called Common Sense and later one called the Crisis, that said that this dispute could not be solved within the bounds of the Hanoverian usurpation, that in order for any measure of justice to be available to the American people, they would have to break the connection with London, break the connection with the king, and set up a democratic republic. Up until then, people like Washington, even Jefferson, Franklin, Hamilton, were landowners, country gentlemen, very loyal to the idea of England, to the replication of English stock on the eastern seaboard of North America, loyal to the crown, didn't seem to have slave owners to boot, very vested in stability and property, didn't see the logic of independence at all, but by the time Paine had finished and the mass audiences had heard him, there was a definite, and the British had acted so stupidly, there was an unstoppable consensus that this was a catalytic moment. And though Paine didn't manage to get a clause into the Declaration of Independence that would have forbidden the slave trade, so the original stain of America is transformed again and rebuilt into the new Constitution and the new set of arrangements. And though that's a tragic failure, there is in the Declaration and later in the Constitution the enshrinement for the first time of the concept of a secular state where the government and the church have nothing to do with each other, where the president is chosen by election and so are the both houses of the legislature. Unbelievably revolutionary for its time. And considering his work to be done, Paine goes back across the Atlantic, becomes very involved with the Marquis de Lafayette and the early framers of the coming Declaration of the Rights of Man, Les Droits de l'Homme, in Paris, and takes part very happily in the early years of the Revolution, and believes it to be the consummation of the American idea, the new world coming back to redress the balance of the old, and is given the key of the Bastille by the Marquis de Lafayette, and takes it back across the Atlantic as a personal present to George Washington, to whom he dedicates the Rights of Man. And you can still go to President Washington's home in Mount Vernon in Virginia and see it hanging on the wall. And then what is his woe and sorrow? But one of his best friends, a man he hugely admires, a man who's been a friend of the American Revolution, Edmund Burke, unmasks his batteries and issues a most incredibly sulphurous diatribe against the French Revolution. It was almost like a lover's quarrel, this, and it's always well worth reading up again, because from that debate we get effectively all of our definitions of left and right, radical and liberal, in Britain, and perhaps in the wider world too. The English Tories claim Burke as one of their own, but he was neither English nor a Tory. He was an Irishman, secret Catholic, who wasn't able to mention his religion during the time of the penal laws, had pled marvellously for the oppressed people of Bengal and elsewhere in India against the East India Company, had tried to get Warren Hastings impeached, had supported the American Revolution, was hoping by indirection to plead for Irish independence, but was utterly horrified by the overthrow of the church and the execution of the king in Paris. And as everyone probably remembers, and as every schoolboy knows, as Macaulay used to say, Mr. Burke produced a moist tribute, a foamingly moist tribute to Marie Antoinette, finding it impossible to imagine that to avenge even a look cast in her direction, that the sword of every gentleman in Europe wouldn't spring from its scabbard just to defend her, and that with the failure to do this, the age of chivalry had died, was gone, and the age of sophists and calculators and economists was upon us. And Paine commented on this lush and lachrymose description of the Austrian usurper, Marie Antoinette, and said, Mr. Burke mourns the plumage and forgets the dying bird. And the argument was off to the races. And Paine essentially wins it, because he says feudalism is over now. It wasn't just this king and this queen that was overthrown, it was the hereditary principle in France. They paid the price for the crimes of their ancestors, among other things. And from now on, the word democracy will be a key word. And up until then, the word democrat or democracy had always been used as an insult, rather as Tory used to be, or suffragette, or impressionist. The trick is to convert an attack word into a badge of pride and call yourself a democrat. And Paine was the first person ever to use the word democracy and democratic in that form. We owe him that much too. But Burke has some important points to make as well, including a very alarmingly prescient foreshadowing of the likelihood that the French Revolution will go Bonapartist, will become a military dictatorship. And anyone who defends Thomas Paine and defends democracy still has to read that passage in Burke's book where he warns what will happen if the revolution goes on in this violent way. So the point I want to make in that connection about Paine is this. He was elected as a deputy to the French Assembly from Calais. And he took part in all the early discussions. And he opposed the motion put forward by Marat for the execution of the king on the grounds that France should start again without medieval forms of punishment, particularly without the death penalty, which Paine abhorred. That it should remember that for all his faults, the French king had helped the American Revolution, that they risked starting off too bloodily and in too authoritarian and dogmatic a way if they went on in this manner. And he very nearly got enough votes, even though he mostly had to speak through an interpreter, to have the execution cancelled and commuted either to life imprisonment or to deportation, exile, on the model of the Stuarts. And was very much attacked by Marat for this, who never forgave him, and said he had no right to speak because he was a Quaker, which he actually was not by then. He's no longer a pacifist. And as the wheel of the terror turned, Thomas Paine was put in the Luxembourg prison, and very nearly died there, and was of illness and neglect, and also was very nearly killed, executed. While there, managed, because he knew the Bible by heart, to write the companion volume to the Rights of Man, which was The Age of Reason, which I'll come to in a minute. But for now, what I want to say is this. Late in his life, he wrote that to have had a hand, in 2 revolutions is to have lived to some purpose. And I think that's a noble thing to have said and been able to say. But I think it's better than that. He had a hand in the revolutions within both those revolutions. In America, he was on the side of the common soldiers and wanted them to have the vote. Any adult male should have the vote. I'm afraid it was only adult male, but it was better than nothing. And he wanted the filthy traffic in human beings to be stopped at once. And was, with Dr. Benjamin Rush and others, the founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society. So he wanted the American Revolution to be more complete and more radical, and he wanted the French Revolution to be less fanatical, less dogmatic, less fratricidal, violating one of its 3 cardinal precepts of fraternity, and to stop the killing and the vendetta. So he wasn't just lucky enough to be a supporter and an inspirer of 2 revolutions, but he was brave enough to take the opposition view within those revolutionary processes themselves. And that I've always thought is the test of a revolutionary and a radical, that they will do that they will fight for their principles among their comrades, which is often the most dangerous place in which to do it. He also, I describe him, I hope, when I bring up all this and the brilliant irony of Arthur Connell and others, there's obviously an element of the romantic here. It's almost like Che Guevara going from one country to another, trying to spread the Promethean flame. And he does belong very much in the age of the early romantics. The other 2 people who wrote replies to Edmund Burke, also heavily censored and persecuted by the reactionary government of William Pitt, were William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. It was probably William Blake who gave Paine the tip-off that he should flee England and get across the Channel as soon as he could, because he was about to be arrested for seditious libel, and had he been so, would certainly have been executed, which I'm very sorry to have to tell you, Edmund Burke favoured for all his broad-mindedness. So he is part of that bliss was it in that dawn element in our history and our culture and our literature. But he was also an eminently practical person. He'd been a staymaker, a corset maker. After that, he'd been a customs and excise official, having that in common with Robert Burns. Oddly enough, also being a bit of a piss artist, having that in common with Robert Burns as well. Strange that there should be 2 drunken customs officials so much involved in our national romance with liberty, but he was also, as I say, a practical part 2 of the Rights of Man. No more talk about how stupid the hereditary principle is. He deals with all that in part 1. He says to have a hereditary monarch is as absurd as having a hereditary mathematician or hereditary poet. It's absurd on its face. He describes the injustices, the wars that are created by kings for their own vanity and so forth. Part 2 is charts, statistical tables, beautifully done design of, who the fuck is that? We know where you live, and we know where your children go to school. It's the design of a welfare state. First time anyone had ever thought of it. He said, why is it that so many people in England work on the land where so much food is produced and they don't have enough to eat? Why is it that when they're too old to work and their muscles have gone, they're thrown out on the parish to die? Why is it that people live like beasts in the city? How can this be? And he designs a welfare system whereby anyone at the age of their majority would receive a lump sum on which to get married and to start their own business. And that would be more or less up to them to deal with. He doesn't mention healthcare. He's not that advanced quite. But when they get too old to work, there's provision made for the elderly and for widows and for orphans. It's minutely costed. It goes through William Pitt's appallingly reactionary budget, and it turns it upside down. And it's a very absorbing document to read. I went to talk about Paine last week at the Institute for IPPR. Is that the Institute for Public Policy Research? Yes. It's one of those rather suave Blair Project think tanks. Nice office in Covent Garden, that kind of thing. And to my surprise, I found that they were readying a document about a streamlined welfare state, which would include the idea of giving people at the age of their majority a lump sum that would come out of an investment made for them when they were born. And the whole glossy pamphlet begins with a long extract from Thomas Paine on agrarian justice. So I felt I didn't have to make my point about his continuing relevance in these circumstances. My mission statement, by the way, is that I don't leave, if there's anyone around who can possibly say I didn't answer a question. And the other mission statement is I presume that people come here to talk as well as to listen, and it's now 12:05, so I'll condense my remarks a bit, if I may. I should say perhaps a little about his, I want to say a lot. I'll say a little about the Age of Reason. In his early pamphlets, Paine was a bit of an opportunist. He would sometimes say monarchy is condemned in the Old Testament, which, as you know, sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. He knew that his audience all knew the Bible and probably knew no other book. He was very good at doing biblical allusions for propaganda purposes and a bit tricky about it some of the time. So there was a considerable shock when he published The Age of Reason, in which he maintained that the Bible is a tissue of lies from the beginning to the end, and full of evil, and full of instructions that, if followed, would be disastrous and wicked, and that it's a plagiarism based upon a hearsay, based on a hearsay. He goes through it from everything, all the things that we village atheists like, to where did Cain get his wife, to do you know how many other children the Virgin Mary had? By the way, do you know? It's 4. It's all in there. Wonderful stuff. But also saying how there can't really be any revelation of truth, because those who report it can't be trusted. We cannot believe someone who says they've talked directly to God on their own unsupported word. Common sense, if you like. But very, very devastating. Once again, there have been many philosophers. Hobbes was probably one of them, of the ones I've mentioned, who were privately atheist. David Hume, I think it's almost certain, was. Some people think Francis Bacon was too. But you kept quiet about it. You did not say, except to philosophical friends. Paine is the first one to go to a printer and produce a cheap book that anyone can read, saying, what the priests have been telling you is wrong. It's lies and it's evil. And it's false. And this is absolutely devastating. Quite a number of his radical friends won't talk to him after that. But I think he's got there the main point, which is that you can't really have the rights of man asserted without an Age of Reason that denies an interventionist God. Because if the promises of religion are true in any respect, then there's no need for social reform. There's no need for democracy. The promise can be fulfilled in some other way. By prayer, for example, or by good works, or by faith. And none of which work. And so for Paine to make this connection means that he's really the founding father not just of the American Revolution and in part of the French one, but of what we call the Enlightenment, of the realization that precisely because we are alone, we must turn to one another. Now, I can't say that Paine was an atheist as I am. He actually wrote The Age of Reason to vindicate God. He was a deist. In other words, he believed that there must have been a creator because of the order of nature and the universe, but that this creator took no further interest in his creation, didn't intervene, didn't answer prayers. He said that it was essential to defend the benevolent idea of the creator from the appalling accretions of the religious and of the faithful. So it's a very interesting book. It's written just before Darwinism becomes available to anybody. It's as far as anyone can then see. people like Jefferson and Paine and others used to look at the rocks and look at the rock formations in Virginia, and they would think, how did the seashells get so far up the mountains? They had no idea. They weren't to know. As far as could be known in their time, deism was a logical and defensible proposition. And so there you have it, if you like, the twinning of the two ideas. And in my opinion, if he'd done only these two things and not just led the exemplary and courageous life that he did manage to do, he would still deserve to be remembered as the most useful Englishman there ever was, as Kenneth Griffith, that great Welshman, once put it in a wonderful drama documentary he did about Paine. The most useful Englishman there ever was. I give you to him, ladies and gentlemen, Thomas Paine. Thank you.
Is it on? I like the notion of democracy being changed from a pejorative word to one which is a badge that we wear with honour. Do you think now it's going the other way? That now we're perhaps not happy to be associated with those who use the word democracy?
No, I think it's, well, first, I agree with you that it's nice when that happens. I mean, it was clever of the Tories to take on this charge, and Impressionist also, was the reviewer's taunt and the suffragette and so forth. And we have had extensions of this recently with people resuming the word queer, for example, if they're homosexual, and even adopting a word that actually I do not use if they're black. I don't think should be used, but all right. You can see what the effort is being made there. What we have done with democracy, I think, is to assume that it's any measurement of public opinion. It's not another problem altogether. I mean, when I was young, there was quite an argument about whether newspapers should even publish opinion polls, because they were thought to be unscientific and probably too easy to skew. Now newspapers commission expensive opinion polls, usually in concert with a television or broadcasting organization, commission their own polls and then print their own findings as news on the front page when they've got nothing else to do. This is a parody of democracy. It's not even populism, really. It's pseudoscience, for one thing, and it's anti-democratic for another. No, I fear people have got so attached to it that they've forgotten what it means, this word now. So it could possibly be that one is due for a new word, and I'll brood on that. Popular sovereignty, no, it doesn't work.
Why do you think we don't honour Paine? And if we were to redress that, what would be a fitting memorial?
Well, the reason initially he wasn't honoured was when he fled the country, he would have been hanged if he'd stayed. He'd incited mutiny among the American colonists, and he took the French side fairly consistently during the Napoleonic Wars. In fact, because I thought I'd better hand the microphone over to you, ladies and gentlemen, I cut a bit I was going to say about a couple of his downsides. One of them being that though he saw through Napoleon right away, and through the Directory, met him briefly and didn't like him, he was still so wedded to the idea of France and its defence that he was willing to tolerate extreme measures being employed of repression, and he always hoped that the French army would invade Great Britain and set up a republic there, as it had in other countries. And I think he'd been too long away from home, because who here has read Patrick O'Brien's seafaring novels? Nothing like enough. So you've got Flanagan now. That's just only a trilogy. With O'Brien, it's 20, I think, but they're quite short. They're brilliant. Well, anyway, I'll tell you quickly. These are the new type of Englishman. No, excuse me, of Britain, who Linda Colley wrote so well about in her history a few years ago, who are drawn from all parts of the country, are thinking of themselves as British for the first time, singing the national anthem, which has only just been more or less promulgated. But they're very subversive below decks. There are all kinds of Cromwellian-type cult organizations and little splinter groups operating among the crews, and millennial leftovers, some of them from the 1650s and 60s, very, very fascinating, and very democratical, as they would have said, very radical, but absolutely no quarter given to the French. Because what has Napoleon gone and done? He's had himself proclaimed emperor by the Pope. He's restored papistry to France and made himself an emperor. So they have no trouble at all, however radical they are, however hostile to the excise man, the press gang, the king, and the rest of it, fighting against France. And I don't think Paine realized this at all. So there was an obvious sense in which it was easy for the Tories to indict him as a traitor. I think that explains some of it. Then there's the atheism, the public contempt for the church. You don't get a plaque in Westminster Abbey for that. And you shouldn't, of course, want one. I mean, I'm never sure whether I should complain in Washington or not that there isn't a plaque for him. Maybe it's best that there isn't and that he can be found in decoding poems like that. Probably that's best.
You mentioned that Thomas Paine wanted the abolition of slavery. So I'm over here. I've got
so much light in my eye, I might have put my shades on.
Sorry. I saw some drafts of the Constitution in New York Public Library some years back.
Oh, yeah.
And there, in one of the drafts, was the call for abolition of slavery. And I was looking at this draft of the Constitution, and there was the line, and I was thinking, why was it taken out? Because had it stayed in, the impact on American history thereafter would have been gigantic. And I was sort of blown away looking at this line in the early draft, and I just wondered what happened.
It makes you weep. Well, there are two reasons why. One, very obviously, is that the delegations from Georgia and the two Carolinas would not have signed the Declaration of Independence if it included that concept, the clause that Jefferson wrote in. And the other thing, as Jefferson pointed out, there was many people who didn't own slaves but were very much involved in the trade of carrying them, either up and down the coast or across the Atlantic, usually from New York and Philadelphia. So there were quite a lot of people in the interests, in other words, in the more enlightened states even, that didn't want to tamper with the trade. So they lost. Much worse, I think, is the sequel, which is that when, as a result of the revolution in Haiti, okay, I'm going to try this once more. Who here has read Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James? Excellent. More than I thought. Get it read, though, the rest of you. Unbelievable history by a Trinidadian historian of the first black republic ever proclaimed, inspired by the ideas of the French Revolution, led by a genius general called Toussaint Louverture, in what was then called Santo Domingo, is now Haiti, around the turn of the 18th, 19th centuries. We owe a lot to this slave army because it completely destroyed, along with Yellow Jack and cholera and a few other things, a French fleet and a French army. And it forced Napoleon and Talleyrand to put the Louisiana territories up for sale. And Jefferson was clever enough to buy them, thus doubling the size of the United States overnight for 10 cents an acre, the best land deal in history. And the idea came to him from Paine. Paine said, I think the French would give up. They'd give us the land and we could start again. And he and Joel Barlow went to the president and said, there's a condition, which is we must start again without slavery. We mustn't have it in these new territories. We can begin again without the original sin. But just as the cotton interests had won the first time, the sugar interest in the Caribbean needed that crop brought in very quickly from Louisiana, and they continued to import slaves through New Orleans. So the chance was lost, and in fact that makes the American Civil War inevitable, because new states are cloned out of Louisiana, and by the time it's finished there are as many slaves as there are free states, and there's only going to be one outcome. So reading back over that gives one the sense of the real lineaments of tragedy. Tragedy is not when princesses are run over in Paris. Tragedy is, well, there's the Greek one, the fatal flaw in either the enterprise or the human being, and there's the Hegelian one, when two rights collide. That's when you get tragedy. And this will meet both those definitions.
Hello. Might capitalism be the word that's usurped democracy? And second, are the rights of man compromised as a direct result of an expanding population?
Well, Milton Friedman's theory is that capitalism is the word for democracy, because just as you as a consumer have your way in the market by choosing how you'll spend your money and on whom or on which, as between any number of possibles, so you do that with your vote. Your vote is like your dollar bill or pound coin. Fatuous, I've always thought. Well, very, very, very simplistic in that capitalism has shown itself more than able to coexist with extreme forms of dictatorship, from apartheid in South Africa to fascism and National Socialism in Europe. So there's nothing, it seems, innately necessarily democratic about capitalism with its persistent tendency to monopoly. So that's to the first point. However, Paine would have been more likely, I think, to be with you. He was against government intervention where it could be avoided. He was for a welfare floor and ceiling, safety net. But he was a small government man. He didn't trust the state at all, and wrote many safeguards against state power and for separation of power, helped write them into the Constitution. So, and was often quoted by Ronald Reagan as a libertarian, for example, and as a foe of all tyranny, and is quite popular on the American libertarian right. For your interest, I'm not sure I got your second question, sir, or second half. Is democracy, was democracy compromised by increase in population?
Yeah.
No. I mean, the population of Britain at the time Paine was writing was, I don't know, probably not more than 10 million. London was the biggest city in the world and had 600,000 people, roughly. So, there are more of us with more rights, as you can easily see. There were no rights then, really, at all. The concept wasn't known until Paine introduced it.
You suggest, sir, that Paine's way forward was to turn to one another. As a Christian, I believe that the basis of Christianity is just that. That love thy neighbour is a tenet that's observed by those who wish to turn to one another. And what on earth then has happened to man's inhumanity to man? The world is full of man's inhumanity to man at the moment. So the opportunity man has isn't strictly being taken up, is it?
The instruction to do right by your neighbour is actually from Rabbi Hillel from the Babylonian captivity, who invented what's called the Golden Rule. You don't do anything to another person you wouldn't want them to do to you. Christianity is an inept plagiarism of that, as it is of Judaism in general. And it also asks you to do the impossible. It says you must love your neighbour as yourself. No one can be expected to do that. It's a ridiculous proposition. We are not so made as to do that. We're also told to take no thought for the morrow, to care nothing for thrift or investment or education, to give up everything. A doctrine which must be immoral, not just on its face, but because it could only be preached by someone who thought the world was about to come to an end and was hoping that it would, which is itself an immoral desire. The eschatological pornography that underlies all religion. It's not a religion of... You can go through the whole New Testament, as I have done, and as Paine did, and you'll find that though people are constantly being commanded to commit genocide and to impose slavery, ordered, mandated to do that, and to have their children stoned if they're disobedient, and to do unbelievably other awful things, burn witches, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, all of that, document revolting evil. It's really a relief to know that there isn't a word of truth in the story. As Israeli archaeology has now conclusively proved, there was no Exodus, there was no wandering in Sinai. All of that's all made up. Good thing too. But there's no mention of hell. No one's condemned to hell in the Old Testament at all. Not until gentle Jesus, meek and mild, are you condemned to burn forever if you don't agree with his preposterous offering. Making war on the dead, punishing the dead for eternity. You're welcome to your Christianity, sir.
Chris, you have contextualized Paine for us in terms of the American Revolution and the French Revolution. If we were ever to have a revolution in Britain, which perhaps might start with a written constitution, how relevant would Paine be now for us?
Well, I'm a founding subscriber of an organization you may have heard of called Charter 88, which has campaigned with some success for the idea of a written Bill of Rights, and which I think would involve, inevitably, as the discussion went on, the transformation the country into a republic, or perhaps a federation of republics within Europe. And we'd owe a huge amount to Paine if that project was forwarded. In fact, we owe a huge amount to him that it was ever put on paper in the first place. It shows that it is part of, it's not dreamt up by some group of chattering class people, that it's very deep in the grain and the grit of the English and the British people. It is part of our tradition. It's the one that's buried, that's forgotten, but is ineffaceable, ineradicable. No, there'd be no doubt that he'd be one of the founding fathers there. And Gerard Winstanley, and Thomas Rainsbow. Can I be a bit more specific? Probably not. Well, not in the available time, but we could have a glass of refreshment.
It's clear that Thomas Paine was intellectually imaginative, but does that intellectual imagination actually reach to cultures where notions of liberty and democracy are not historically attractive and are not currently attractive?
Well, it's been my experience, and it was Paine's, I think, that even the most apparently unpromising societies are perfectly able to see the point that if there are to be rulers, they had better arise from the people, that no one should find themselves living under a government that he hasn't chosen to put himself under. And no one should be denied the chance to change their government. It was the great vice of Burke's book, as he says that, okay, we did have one revolution in 1688, and retrospectively, even though it was an anti-Catholic revolution, he said that was all right. In fact, it was a glorious one. He said, but that's once and for all time. It can never be changed anymore. The compact that it institutes is permanent, unalterable. Well, that's absurd on its face, even if the William and Mary settlement wasn't absurd in itself. People can get these points very easily, and the idea that they want to know what their rights are and be able to go to a court to assert them is something people are thirsty for in every place I've been. And I've never been anywhere where something like the American Constitution wouldn't be an improvement, in other words. Because it's essentially simple, and Paine was able to reach people who knew very little about books and ideas, but who were learning to read, and they got the point right away. And if you can do it to the people as thick as the English, I think there's nowhere it couldn't take root. Thick and conservative, as the English.
Do you think that if Thomas Paine was alive today, he would speak out at peace rallies? Do you think he'd be as critical of Islam as perhaps some would be of Christianity? Or do you think he'd perhaps just be a newspaper columnist?
I don't know that he would have sunk as low as the latter. Thanks for asking, all the same. Well, I can't do this. I read a book about George Orwell once, and people said, well, what would Orwell have thought about this or that? And I said, it's not possible to tell after a certain point. I mean, Orwell died, I'm not avoiding your question, Orwell died very young, but he'd written a great deal about colonialism in Asia, and in the Middle East also, and had personal experience of it. And I think it's possible to say, from knowing his work and his mind, that he would have been opposed to the 1956 intervention at Suez, of which we're having the 50th anniversary this year. I think without any doubt. And I think it's also pardonable to say, plausible to say, that he would have been opposed to the French and American attempt to keep colonialism going in Indochina. I think one can do that. Anything much later than that, one just shouldn't try, I believe. I do know what Paine's attitude to Islam was it's in the Age of Reason. That's very plain. I mean, he didn't know that much about it, but he could see that it is what it is, which is an even more vulgar plagiarism of Judaism and Christianity, usually of the worst bits. It's nothing but a knockoff. But it makes the same mistake as Burke did, in that it says it's the final revelation. There's no need for any more after this. You now have all the information you need. In other words, an explicitly totalitarian ideology. So he would have had no doubt as to what he would think about that. As for peace rallies, no. He had a very, very strong quarrel with his Quaker brethren, because they not only abstained from the war against the British Crown in America, but they actually in the end called for people to keep their oath of allegiance to the Crown. So as so often with pacifists, they weren't really neutral. They were on the other side, just like today's anti-war movement is not anti-war at all. It's pro-Saddam Hussein and pro-so-called insurgent. And is led by people like George Galloway, who are pimps for and prostitutes of, an amazing double. Fascism and dictatorship.
That's not the case at all. That's not the case at all, because, for instance, if Hans Blix had been allowed to carry on with his inquiry, we'd have found out that there were no weapons, and the whole thing was based on a spurious plan to go to war that Bush and Blair hatched months and months before that. You don't have to be pro-Saddam to be anti-war. That's rubbish.
You don't have to. Why are you then? I must say I agree that you don't have to be. Why is your movement led by people who are? Now, on you do remind me to say something else, though. Paine definitely believed that the United States should be an imperial power for democracy. He was, as did Jefferson, he wanted it to be an empire for the export of revolution. To Haiti, to South America, beyond, to Europe and to Ireland and beyond. He was very emphatic on that. And that's a problem for many people on the American left, because they have such a bad conscience about so many failed or criminal American foreign policies that they don't believe their country should be or is or even could be a vector for these ideas. But here's the situation, comrades, brothers and sisters, friends. The Russian Revolution is gone. The Chinese Revolution has mutated into a sort of market Stalinism. The Cuban Revolution is moribund. I say nothing against the French Revolution, but its ideas are not really represented by France anymore in any important way. The ideas, of course, of the Declaration of the Rights of Man are still with us. The American Revolution is the only one still standing. You have to take it or leave it. But in my view, it requires thought and not jokes about the president's IQ.
Do you think that the rights of man, or particularly of women, have been increased after the invasion of Iraq? And if so, has it been worth the price? Thank you.
I don't doubt it for one second. That there's been a night and day difference in Iraq as well as in Afghanistan. The flag that you can't see in my lapel is the flag of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, the party whose leader is now the president of Iraq. 4 years ago, Iraq was the private property of a psychopathic crime family. It was a mass grave underneath and a concentration camp on top. It was mass graves and torture chambers, and everyone was citizen of the property of the state. Now the elected president of Iraq is the leader of a democratic socialist party that's the corresponding member of the Socialist International, whose people, as latest 15 years ago, latest 15 years ago, were being subjected to genocide with advanced industrialized weapons of mass murder. There are some people who say they can't see the difference. I think that they are blasé, to put it mildly. I think it's the most... Well, thank you. Very muted applause for that proposition, I can see. There are those who say they can't tell the difference, and, well, they probably can't.
I'd just like to make a comment as a member of the anti-war movement that there were lots of us that were incredibly disappointed when George Galloway was held up as some figurehead for the movement, and also that you've just dismissed a vast movement full of all sorts of people with all sorts of beliefs, and not all of us agree with George Galloway.
I didn't dismiss it. I said, if you think that, why don't you have your own demonstrations that are not led and spoken to by people like Ramsey Clark in the United States, who's the organizer there, or George Galloway or Tariq Ali here, who take the other side in the war. It's not anti-war to say, as Michael Moore does, that the fascist killers in Iraq are the moral equivalent of the Minutemen fighters who were led by Thomas Paine. I'm sorry. As well as being an objectively fascist position, that's also a revolting caricature and not an anti-war one. It's pro-war, but on the other side. If you don't like these people, if you don't want them to be the spokesman, then don't march like sheep behind their banners. Have your own show, for heaven's sake. Show a little pluck. You saw what Galloway... I may as well say this, because even it's not on the subject, but you saw what Galloway has just done. He gave an interview to a slime sheet called Gentleman's Quarterly in America, where he was asked if only Blair was killed, would it be morally justifiable for a suicide bomber to take him out? Galloway said, yes, it would be. He says, though I'm not advocating it. No, he's not, of course. He wouldn't be as brave as that. He's just pre-approving it. Little deniability suits him down to the ground. Well, then there's a bit of a row, as you can imagine, and then he digs up a statement, a rather vapid one, made by Cherie Blair, which 2 nights ago, he said, well, Cherie Blair once said that she sympathized with the despair of the Palestinian suicide bombers. And though, in fact, her statement didn't quite say that, it said that as long as people feel they have no alternative, there won't be much progress. Pretty vacuous statement, but not as Galloway cites it, but just look what's just happened. When he gets in trouble for his remark approving the murder of a 3 times elected Prime Minister, when he gets in trouble, he hides behind the skirts of a woman who he's just called to become a widow. So now every time, the man has no shame, and every time I think he can't go any lower, he makes a fool of me. But I'm on his case, okay? We're not done with George at all yet.
All that said, though, you have to agree that despite the new government, I'm over here. No, other side. Other side.
Oh, hi.
Hello. You have to agree, don't you, that the risk has been quite, well, rather, the price has been quite high, and the country is descending quite slowly into anarchy, and that indeed the only part that could even possibly be credited with running itself is the part left well alone, i.e. the northern Kurdish part of Iraq.
Well, left well alone in the sense it's been taken out of the control of Saddam Hussein, which it had been actually for a while. That was the experiment in regime change beforehand. I can't disagree with what you say, but my estimate of Iraq 5 years ago was that it was an imploding society already. It was beggared and bankrupt. It was Xeroxing its currency. It was the private property. It was completely privatized. Everything in the state was owned by the crime family. They stayed in power by methods of divide and rule, by inciting through different newspapers that they controlled, Sunni against Shia, Shia against Sunni, both against Kurds, mainly our Sunni. The place was going to, if it had not been intervened in, clumsy phrase, I apologize, had there not been an intervention, there's every chance that Iraq could have become to the Gulf what Congo has become to Southwest Africa, a sort of vortex into which forces would certainly have been drawn. Iraq would have been invaded, all right, don't you worry about that, but it would have been invaded by Turkey and Iran and Saudi Arabia, each with their most extreme client of the respective faction. We intervened far too late, should have all been taken care of in 1991, not my fault that it wasn't. And we may have intervened before it went over, just before it went over the cliff, we don't know. But that it's a noble cause and a just war, I make no doubt at all.
Christopher, perhaps we can come back to Thomas Paine.
By all means.
You were fairly quick in your apology that he didn't extend his definition of mankind to include womankind. Why do you, Christopher, think that the authors of the Declaration of Independence failed to see that self-evident fact?
It's really remarkable when you consider who some of their wives were, if only that. I mean, Abigail Adams, for example, people of this kind. Not perhaps Martha Jefferson, who was a bit of a mouse and a recluse, but it just didn't cross their minds at all. Remember Mary Wollstonecraft, who is Paine's emulator, and writes her own very brilliant attack on Edmund Burke, publishes The Vindication of the Rights of Women when? To be absolutely honest with you, I don't know the exact date. After the Rights of Man, I'm fairly sure, as the natural counterpart. And Paine would have accepted that. His relations with women were always very distraught, as it happens as well. Very. I don't know whether that has anything to do with it or not. But it's an extraordinary deafness among that whole revolutionary generation. If you could bring Jefferson back now to play the game I said I wouldn't play, what would surprise him? The thing that would surprise him most would be that Canada had still not been conquered. He would think, what have the young men of America been doing? Are they asleep? The Union Jack still flies over a whole chunk of North America. This is outrageous. That would really upset him. Mixed marriage, as we call it, is not mixed, because there are no such things as races, but you know what I mean, would amaze him, including the number of his own descendants who can now be identified through DNA. and American womanhood would absolutely shatter him, as it would have done Paine. But all I can say for this lot is that when the Seneca Falls Conference is convened just before the Civil War, and women start to attach themselves to the claims of right being made by slaves and others, Thomas Paine is always mentioned in their discussions. He's sort of revived, as he was in the birth of the labour movement and the Chartist movement in England. He's always been part of that sort of unspoken history, but unsung, I mean, but not quite unspoken, not forgotten, that is brilliantly evoked by Edward Thompson in Making of the English Working Class. He's part of the collective memory of the educated working man, and for that reason imperishable.
Yes. Up here on the decking. Right.
It's like an interrogation to me. I cannot see very well beyond these lights.
I think what's more important is my question, not whether you can.
Could you give it some welly, sir? I can't.
Yes. Is that better?
Much.
Good. Looking at applying the sorts of principles that came out from the rights of man to the sort of issues we have today, not what Thomas Paine would have said, but how can we learn to apply them, for example, about the way the individual human rights are often trodden over and are given less weight than the sanctity of the state, the preservation of borders, whatever goes on in between them, about how do we sort out, for example, what goes on in the Congo and the misery there. Or if we look alternatively now, we have a world fight between Islam, those who want Sharia law, those who don't, and we're all caught up in it. How do these principles you've spoken about today help us to understand those kinds of problems?
Well, on the matter of asserting civil liberty against the state, I would hope it was self-evident. I mean, I'm a very strong supporter of the regime change policy in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I hope tomorrow and soon in Syria and in Iran. Not necessarily imposed from outside, but supported by the international community. I'm also a plaintiff in the lawsuit brought by the American Civil Liberties Union against the Department of Justice and the National Security Association for warrantless wiretapping. I'm a named litigant in that suit, which will be heard in a federal court in Michigan next week. It's very important, especially in times of combat, when the state has all the excuses it thinks it needs to coerce people and to silence them and to say it's for their own good. Just like Christianity, the worst thing about its dictatorship is that it's benign. That's the horrible bit. The benign stuff is the revolting stuff. So that I hope one could take as read. The reason I'm glad I'm doing this book now is that obviously the great question in the world is the battle between the secular and theocratic forces. And it's going to be that way for a long time. And I've got a red light here now, but I'll just say this. If you take the best known dispute and the longest running one that goes back to the League of Nations, the Palestine question, I once heard the late Abba Eban, rather charming Israeli liberal politician, former ambassador to the UN, former foreign minister, say that when you looked at this problem, the first thing that struck you about it was how easy it is to solve. I remember thinking, okay, I'll listen to the rest of what he says if he says that. Well, you have approximately equally balanced peoples, Jewish and Arab, roughly the same number of them, with historic claims to the same land and long historic attachments to it, that are not by any means completely compatible, but there is a way of doing it. You can partition the place, at least to begin with, so that everyone is part of it. You can't have one group living on top of the other. That's out of the question. They must be living side by side, which must mean some form of partition. Easy. Everybody wants it. The majority of Israeli Jews consistently say they want it. Prime Minister Abbas says he's sure in a referendum the Palestinians would vote for it too, which whenever they've been tested on it, they have. The PLO supports it, the UN supports it, the EU supports it, the United States supports it, the diaspora Jews support it. Why can't we get it? Because there's a faction of Messianists among the Jews who say God gave them the West Bank and Gaza. Not Gaza, but the West Bank. So there's nothing to negotiate. And it's not difficult for them to find counterparts, Muslim counterparts, who say, you're quite right about that. God did distribute the land. He does make property deals, but in our favor, sorry, not yours. And then, just as if that wouldn't be bad enough, the Christians to the rescue. The American fundamentalist right comes to the aid of the extreme Zionists and says not 1 inch can be given away because it must all be kept in trust for the Messiah who's coming soon. Who will only want, I think it's 99,000 Jews when it's all over to convert. The rest are going straight to hell, but we leave that bit out in the interests of, So that theocracy and religion poison everything. They make it impossible for reason, for rationality, for justice, even to be heard, let alone enacted. And that's in an area where we... Oh, good. Well... And that's in an area where we have quite a lot of purchase and quite a lot of influence and so on. But what is going to happen when bin Laden's forces try again to take away Kashmir? It's Kashmir they care about, by the way, not Palestine. They occasionally use Palestine, and some fools believe that if Palestine was solved, the Al-Qaeda people would stop. How people can believe this, I don't know, in the anti-war movement. But if suppose bin Laden's people have another try and they really do smash up Kashmir and destroy its attachment to the Indian Union will fall apart. The largest and most impressive multicultural, multi-ethnic democracy in the world will fall apart, and the fighting and bloodshed that will be there will make 1947, 1948 completely forgettable. That could happen. That's what they want. They're working at it night and day. So this is a real struggle. They want to destroy everything we care about. They want to take away everything we have. And what is appalling is to see the capitulation of my profession, for example, which wouldn't publish one of the Danish cartoons, which believes that the only problem in the world is avoiding the hurting of people's feelings. Well, I'm sorry. I didn't sign up for this to be inoffensive. And now... There comes a time which every speaker knows when the audience stops looking at its watch and starts shaking. And there comes a time when the red light stops being on.